inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Greet you with the greetings of peace. We begin by praising Allah and sending peace and blessings upon His last and final prophet and messenger, Muhammad, and all those prophets and messengers that have been sent for our guidance and the guidance of all people until the end of time. So, how many of you, just to get a feel, how many of you normally attend our Friday Family Night program on a regular basis anyways? Okay. How many of you just came for this topic in particular? Anyone specifically came for this topic? So a few people. Okay. So, all right. So the topic is going to be, does Allah exist or does God exist? And this actually was originally a debate that I had, after we're done shushing people, this was actually a debate that I had undertaken with an atheist professor whose name was Dan Mages a long time ago, and I thought, you know what, for my Family Friday Night program, I might as well present this topic for a number of reasons. One of the reasons why I chose this topic is because this is a question which many people struggle with, especially in our day and age. But I want to indicate that it's not something that is unique to our society or unique to our generation. In fact, Imam al-Ghazali, the great Muslim scholar who lived about 1,000 years ago, he actually wrote in his autobiography called Deliverance from Error, he wrote that he was warning students that they should be very careful when they study philosophy, and they should be very cautious when they study mathematics. Now keep in mind, this is a great Muslim scholar who's a very educated man. And he's telling people, he's telling Muslims in particular, to be cautious when it comes to studying mathematics. So that seems a little bit strange, right? What's wrong with studying mathematics? So he explains, he says, because mathematics at that time was taught by philosophers, and mathematics was inspired by Greek philosophy along with the metaphysics that the Greek philosophers had. So he said there's two harms that come out of studying math. Number one is that when people study, there's nothing wrong with studying mathematics, but when you actually study how the numbers are being proved and they add up and all of these things, what ends up happening is the people have so much confidence in the ones who are teaching that science of math that they think that every other proof that they determine in the field of mathematics also has the same strength when they talk about philosophy or religious beliefs or anything else. So he says harm number one ends up where a person who's studying math originally thinks that the math teacher, everything that they believe in their own personal life or every idea that they have, that's also going to be true and just as sound as the math that they were teaching in the first place. So he said that many people, they blindly imitate their teachers, assuming that they must be super intelligent because they were in one field and they must be in the other field as well. So this is one of the dangers he talks about. And this danger is prevalent in the society in which we live in. Because what happens is, especially in the Muslim community, almost every single Muslim, or at least in our society here, almost every single one, thank you, has been through school, has been through at minimum high school, or at least through college, whether it's a degree in biology, it's a degree in chemistry, it's a degree in engineering, it's a degree in medicine, whatever it may be. So what ends up happening is we don't tend to realize is that how many of the professors in the universities have actually been deeply religious people. Can I just see a show of hands? Those of you who've attended college in America or in any Western university, have you found the vast majority of your professors and your teachers tend to be very religious people? Who would say that they found that case to be true? Nobody. Anyone found that there's quite a few of their professors who tend to either not talk about religion or actually take stabs at religion or God or belief in any type of religion or something like that? Does anyone find that to be the case? Just raise your hand. All right, so there's a lot of hands being raised for the people who are online live streaming. So the reality is this affects all of us. And before I get to my presentation, I want to indicate that after thinking about this for a very, very long time, the reasons why people end up doubting belief in God and end up belief in Allah and belief in a creator and belief in the fact that the Creator has communicated with human beings is more to do with their emotional state of mind than their intellectual state of mind. So I'm going to say that again, and I've really thought about this for a very long time, is that it has to do more with the emotional state of mind of a person than it is to do with the intellectual state of mind. Today in my presentation, I'm only going to mention the intellectual proofs, and I'm going to address the intellectual issues. But the reality is, human beings don't always make decisions. Almost nobody makes all their decisions purely on rational bases without any type of emotion involved, without any type of consideration for what they've been through in their lives. So I want to address the issues that a lot of parents have come to me and said, you know what, my children, they're questioning me about why should we believe in God. They're questioning me about why should I even be a Muslim. They're questioning me about there's no evidence, good evidence to believe this or believe that. And I'm going to be addressing some of those issues, but you need to understand, and this is like just a preface warning, is that for most people, the root cause of the issue is not purely intellectual. So we can sit down and have a discussion and show a bunch of intellectual proofs and respond to all their doubts. But at the end of the day, if one of their issues was that they had some problem when you were raising them and teaching them how to pray and you yelled at them one time, that emotional baggage or that emotional trauma will take them further away from prayer and thus away from Islam and thus away from God than these intellectual doubts actually would have in the first place. So what I'm telling you today is how you respond to some of these things intellectually, but the emotional aspect is completely different. And it needs to be addressed in a totally separate way through some type of counseling or some type of validation of the person's concerns or something along those lines. So that's my disclaimer that I'm focusing on this, but it's not necessarily going to be the answer to everyone's problems that they're going through. Okay? So, and I will take questions at the end, and I'll open up for questions because I know there's going to be a lot of questions. So in the society we live in today, atheism is defined to be the rejection of belief in God. And agnosticism is defined to be kind of like somebody saying, I'm not sure, and I haven't made up my mind, and right now I'm just kind of in limbo. I'm just kind of sitting in the middle somewhere. And the vast majority of people, just to give you some statistics here, there's approximately how many people in the world? The world population is approximately how many? About 7 billion. About 7 billion people. And about over 2 billion of them identify as Christians. 1.6 billion of them identify as Muslims. Guess what the third largest religion in the world is? It's the I don't knows. It's agnosticism or secularism or irreligiousness, where I don't follow any religion, and that's approximately 1 billion people. So if you want to talk about largest religions, and I consider this to be a religion, if you want to talk about largest religions in the world, we're talking about the third largest religion in the world. Not necessarily atheism, by the way. There's a difference. But this is kind of what we're going to be addressing today. Okay? So let's begin. Bismillah. First of all, where's the burden of proof? This is one of the core issues that need to be addressed. Because when people who are believers, when people who are Muslims, they're actually asking themselves, well, what? If somebody asks them, well, why do you believe in God? Why do you believe in Allah? They'll say, oh, well, because the Quran says so. They say, well, because I was taught that way. Or they'll say, because it just makes sense. And they say, okay, well, explain to me how it makes sense. So now there's this burden of proof, and if you ask many people, or quite a significant number of people, if you ask them, why do you believe in Allah? They can't necessarily provide you a good explanation of why. Doesn't mean that their position becomes weaker necessarily, but they're not able to objectively convince another person why they actually believe. So what happens is, when someone cannot answer the question, why do you believe in God? Why do you believe in a creator? Why do you believe in Allah? Then what ends up happening is saying, well, you know what? The burden of proof is only on you. Right? It's only on you, and it's not on me. So the default position is to not believe in any creator, to just believe everything is just the way it is, and there is no God, there is no creator, there is nothing else. We just are in the state that we are in, and therefore all the proof lies on you. You have to convince me, why I must believe in God. Now let me tell you the problem with that statement. The problem is that this idea of atheism is not the default position. It is not the standard position that someone automatically doesn't believe. Even though you may think that that may be the case, it's not the case. And let me explain to you why. We live in a world and we have a mind that's able to process information and rationally think. And when we come along and we see some effects taking place in the world, we as human beings, even children, we want to give an explanation for things about why they happen. So if you take a little child, right, and this bottle of water is sitting here, and this child comes and all of a sudden the child looks away and the bottle of water tips over and the child looks back. What do they think immediately in their mind? They don't all of a sudden say, well, the bottle has just naturally transferred in from one state to another state and there must have been no causal force or no reason for this taking place. Imam al-Razi, who's a great scholar of tafsir, explanation of exegesis of the Quran, he explains if you were to hide behind a rock and you were to throw a pebble and the pebble would land, even if there was a little child of like a few years old, what would their reaction be when the pebble lands? They would look around and they would start trying to think, where did it come from? Who threw this rock? Who threw this pebble? And how did it land here and what happened? Why? Because our brains are naturally hardwired to think in terms of cause and effect. They're naturally designed to actually want to get to the root cause of the problem. So of what's happening. Why do things exist? And that's why children ask questions all the time. Why is there rain? Where does the rain come from? Mommy, where do babies come from? Where does this come from? It's natural. Every society, universally, throughout the world, you have children asking these kind of questions. Because their brains are designed that way, that's the way they are, no one will deny that. So what happens is, the world in which we live in exists. There are things and processes taking place. There are mountains, and there's rain, and there's systems, and there's cycles, and our bodies have digestive systems. Our bodies exist in a certain way. So therefore, we have an obligation, right? We have this inner necessity to explain why things are the way that they are. Now, if somebody comes along and gives an explanation and says, well, I think that the best explanation for everything that exists is that somebody created it. And that's what we say, God. We say Allah is the creator who created all of these things. And somebody rejects it and say, I don't believe in your explanation. They have to offer a counter explanation. Because if you come along and say, you know what? The reason why the economy is going down right now, the economy is in decline, or oil prices right now are declining. So somebody comes along and says, you know why oil prices are declining? It's because of the invasion of Iraq. And someone says, you know what? I don't accept that theory. You say, okay, so what's your explanation? You say, I don't need to give an explanation. All I need to do is reject the explanation, and your explanation, by default, my position of rejection is the automatic default position. But you know what? The reality is, oil prices are declining. You need to give an explanation for that. When someone says that I believe that God exists and God is the one who created all of this, if you deny that and reject it and say, I don't believe in this, you have to provide an alternative explanation, and the burden of proof is also on you to explain the phenomena that exists around us. So the world in which we live, we need to explain it. We need to explain why things are the way they are. We need to explain why our body exists in the way that it does. Why do we have certain capabilities that we do? And the burden of proof is not only on one party, it's actually on both parties. So this is very, very important to understand, that if somebody comes along and says, well, prove to me that God exists, you should not answer and say, well, prove to me that he doesn't exist. A lot of Muslims do that, and you shouldn't do that. Instead, what you should do is say, this is why I believe God exists, and we're going to talk more about it. And if someone says, I don't believe that, say, well, now the burden of proof is on you to explain to me the contrary position. So this is point number one. We need to talk about the burden of proof there, right? So there's this few misconceptions there. Misconception number one, when it comes to atheism, is that reason and science is on the side of the atheist, automatically by default. That there's this perception that religious people, regardless of what religion they are, I'm only talking about Islam. and I don't like to generalize the use of the word religion, but people who are religious by nature, meaning Islamic by nature or whatever it is, they tend to be people who have blind leaps of faith. They tend to be people who don't really think properly, don't really process information. They're not very scientific in their thinking. And right now, science and reason is actually on the side of disbelief in Allah. So that's a misconception that a lot of people have. And we're going to try to address this misconception, okay? The second is that disbelief requires no effort whatsoever. So again, the default position is naturally that people are going to go ahead and just disbelieve in things, and as long as you don't take a stance, you don't take a position on anything, you're naturally going to be okay and you're in a neutral stance. Let me give you a scenario of a bank. Imagine you're in a bank and the bank is being robbed. Okay, there's a bank robbery taking place, and the guy, let's say he doesn't have a gun, he doesn't have anything, right? And he's got something. All the people who are in there, they have a moral choice. They can either try to do something to stop the person from, engaging in some criminal act, or they can sit there and watch it take place. Let's say somebody's getting beaten up. Imagine someone's getting beaten up and you can call the police. You can either call the police, or you can walk by and say, this is not my problem, I don't need to deal with it. Is there a third option of neutrality where you can say, I cannot make up my decision. I cannot make up my mind on what I want to do. Therefore, I'm neither going to help, nor am I going to call the police, and I'm not going to intervene, I'm not going to do anything. I'm neutral, I'm taking a neutral stance. Is that a valid position? It wouldn't be a neutral stance. Why? Because you're placed in a position where you need to take a stance. If you're in a city, this is how the Prophet, peace be upon him, described it. If you're in a city, and there's an army coming to attack the city, and people give you information that there's an army coming and it's going to kill every single person in the city, you have two options. Either you abandon the city and you believe the information, or you stay in the city and you allow the army to come and attack you. If you say, you know what, I don't know if I can trust the person. I don't know if I believe whether they're telling me the truth or they're not telling me the truth. I can't make up my mind, therefore I'm going to remain neutral. What's going to end up happening to you? If the information turned out to be true, what would happen to you? You're going to be killed in the city. You're going to be destroyed in the city. So this is what I want to explain to people. When it comes to believing in God, right, if it's true and if it's real, regardless of whether it's real, there's a reality out there, you need to take a stance. So an atheist is taking a firm stance, and a believer is taking a firm stance, and the agnostic, who happens to be 1 billion people, oftentimes fall into this idea that I'm taking a neutral stance, I don't want to make up my mind, and I don't want to be dogmatic, I don't want to join either side, I just want to be in the middle because I can't decide right now, and I'll figure it out some later date. What ends up happening is they are taking a stance, and it's not a stance of neutrality. Because when you're talking about something that involves explanation of something or justice or dealing with a principle that affects you and affects everyone around you, there is no neutral stance. You have to take a position. So I want to make this very, very clear. It actually takes effort to disbelieve. It's not the default stance. It's not the default position. So I gave the analogy of a crime, an analogy of a judge. Let's talk about this idea of belief being a leap of faith. Okay? There's this idea that unfortunately a lot of people, you do find a lot of people who believe in God. They say, why do you believe in God? Say, you just have to believe. It's something that you feel in your heart. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to prove it. It's just something that I know, and I don't need to explain it or convince anybody else with regards to, why this is the case. And this idea of the leap of faith doesn't exist in Islam. I want to make that very clear. It may exist in some other religions, but the idea that believing in God is a leap of faith that you don't have a rational basis for, you don't have a good explanation for, it's something that you just feel, doesn't exist in Islam. Because the Quran is replete with examples of reflection, pondering, thinking about the universe and why it's there and where it came from and what was its cause and all of these things. So to get that out of the way, this misconception or this stereotype of people who believe in God may apply to certain groups of people, but it doesn't apply across the board. So it's not about blind belief, right? And this idea of leaving your inherited beliefs is also a common thing. I was listening to a book called The God Delusion. Anyone heard of this book by Richard Dawkins, famous atheist? Raise your hand. Anyone read this book? I said, no one's read this book. But he's a very famous atheist in the world, and he talks a lot about how all these children are born upon a faith. And he said we should stop using the term Muslim child, Jewish child, Christian child, because a child cannot actually follow a particular religion. They simply inherit their beliefs, and they're the victims, according to him, they're the victims of blind indoctrination coming from their parents. The problem with that is that he, as an atheist, doesn't give the same explanation for his own children or for his own beliefs. That you can actually have a generation of people who are being raised and being brought up as atheists. And I'm going to make the argument that the vast majority of people who do not teach their children any type of religion, or they do not give them a solid religious foundation, what kind of system are they actually walking into when almost every single one of them attends a university and gets a bachelor's degree at minimum? They're walking into a secular system which you're not supposed to remember or mention God in any classroom, not in an economics classroom, not in a biology classroom, not in a chemistry classroom, not in a computer science classroom, not in a journalism classroom, definitely not in a philosophy classroom or in a liberal arts classroom or whatever it may be. So what ends up happening is that people are actually being raised with very minimal religious education, and then they go into a secular system, and they're naturally going to be influenced. And what you have is that you have this idea that people grow up on religion and then they start abandoning it. But in America, and if you look at Western Europe in particular, you find that the vast majority of people are actually tending to leave their religions that they actually supposedly ascribe to, or their parents used to maybe attend church once in a while. And this is what's happening right now. So the idea of inherited beliefs, that your parents raise you upon a certain type of belief, it exists in Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said that every single child is born upon a natural disposition. And then he said that his parents Judaize him, raise him as a Jew, or Christianize him, raise him as a Christian, or paganize him, raise him up as a fire worshiper or an idol worshiper or as a pagan. Now, this is a process and a part of reality. Every single person is going to initially grow up according to the way that their parents teach them. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist, it doesn't matter if you're agnostic, it doesn't matter if you're a Christian, it doesn't matter if you're a Jew. Whatever you are, your parents are going to be your primary source for actually learning your beliefs and what you need to know as a human being. They teach you how to use the bathroom, they give you food, they do all of that things for you. What's the second source in today's society after your parents that are going to determine what kind of beliefs you have as you start to grow up? Can anyone think what is one of the major influences upon people? Your education, your teachers. The teachers that you have and the things that they're teaching you is going to be a second factor. And what's the third factor? Media, society, entertainment, all of that. So this is the problem with Dawkins' argument, is that he only selectively applies the idea that children are raised according to their religious beliefs because their parents had the same beliefs. It applies regardless of what type of child it is, regardless of what religion they come from, whether they have a religion, whether they believe in God, whether they don't believe in God. This argument applies across the board. This is what Islam says. Islam says that when a child reaches the age of maturity and becomes an adult, they're able to start thinking rationally for themselves. They automatically make a choice now, whether they're going to, one, stay in the religion that their parents raised them on, or the irreligion or the atheism or the agnosticism that their parents raised them on, and whether they're going to stay in that state or not. Or number two, whether they're going to outwardly accept what their parents had taught them, but inwardly act as a hypocrite inside and not actually believe what they were taught. But they're making a conscious decision, and they're going to be held responsible for that decision. And this is what Islam says. Islam says that every single child, when they reach the age of maturity, they have the ability now to make a decision. So this idea of inherited beliefs, and that you will continue to believe what you inherited, because if you look at most Christians, their children end up becoming Christians. You look at most Muslims, their children end up becoming Muslims. You look at most atheists, their children end up becoming atheists. Does that prove some determinism that exists in the world? No. Why? Because you find so many counter cases, so many cases to the contrary. Just because it's a trend doesn't necessarily mean that it's deterministic in nature. So this is one aspect we need to get across, and we need to move forward. Is belief natural? Is belief in God something that is natural, or is it something that, people, had to figure out or made up or something like that? Let's talk about Islam and let's talk about the Quran. I'm addressing primarily Muslims and primarily what Islam says about belief. So the Quran, if you look at the Quran, 600 pages, 114 chapters, rarely does it actually address atheists. It addresses Jews, it addresses Christians, it addresses pagans, it addresses people of different religions, people who worship the stars, people who worship fire, but it rarely ever addresses atheists. Now, Islam says that it's a universal religion. So why is it not addressing atheists? There's a reason for that. Let's talk about the reason. Number one, historically, atheists have always been a minority. And today, like I said, even though I said 1 billion people are agnostic or irreligious or secular, the atheists, the ones who claim to be firmly disbelieving in God, are actually still remain the minority. So in terms of throughout history, this has been a very small group of people relatively. Influential group of people, but a small group of people. So that's the first thing. And then there are 4 principles we need to discuss, all right? The 4 principles which all human beings should agree upon, that this is the way human beings generally think. If you take these 4 principles and synthesize them together, you will actually understand why people, and Muslims in particular, believe in God and believe in a creator. So let's look at these 4 principles. Number 1, seeing is not believing. One of the common arguments that you find people having conversations about is, if I can't see God, I can't see Him, I can't measure Him, I can't test Him, I've never seen Him. Have you seen Him? No. Has anyone else seen Him? Do you know anyone who's seen Him? No. Therefore, He doesn't exist. Simple as that. Anyone have seen this conversation take place? Anybody? Raise your hand. It's quite common. So the thing is, we have to go back and ask ourselves a question. First of all, do we always believe in things that we can only see or that we can perceive or that we can test? No, not necessarily. Let's just talk about seeing first of all. When people say, can you see Him? Can you do this? Can you do that? You say no. So how many things do we believe that we actually cannot see, we cannot perceive directly, but we can actually sense the effects of those things? If you look at your cell phone has a reception. And if you, depending on what type of cell phone carrier you have, your reception is going to be going up and down throughout the day. You look at how many bars you have and you're always looking, do I have reception now? Do I not have reception? You're seeing a simple signal, but you're not seeing the actual waves that are being transmitted to your phone that are going to determine where that signal is shifting, right? You don't actually see that, but you believe in it. Why do you believe in it? Because you believe in the effect that actually reaches you. When your friend sends you a text message, you do not actually see the message that's being sent until it arrives at your screen. How do you know that it was communicated to you? You see the effect on your phone. So from the effect, you determine that this must have been sent from somewhere, even though I was not able to directly perceive where it actually came from. So if you think about that, every single day we actually believe in things that we cannot perceive, that we cannot sense, and that we cannot even see. If you think about magnetism, the same thing. We've been believing in this for a long time because you can see the effects that are taking place. If you think about the cell phone towers, if you look at theoretical physics, during the time of Einstein came up with a new theory, this theory of relativity and all of that. He said that there are not 3 dimensions in the world. It used to be believed that there were 3 dimensions in the world, right? 3 planes of existence. And he said, no, we actually live in a 4-dimensional world, not a 3-dimensional world. You guys have forgotten to add the dimension of time. Time is actually a dimension. Therefore, there are 3 dimensions of space, and there's 1 dimension of time. And we live in a 4-dimensional world. Since the time of Einstein, theoretical physicists started increasing that, and they say, no, we actually live in a 5-dimensional world. a 6-dimensional world. 7, 8, 9, 10. The last time I checked, they were at 11. Has anyone heard about 12? No one heard about 12. So the last time I checked, we live in an 11-dimensional world, but you cannot perceive the other dimensions because there's something called string theory and M theory and all of these things combined together. If you look into theoretical physicists, they talk about all these things. And they believe in them, and they believe in them firmly. And yet none of these people can perceive it. In fact, if you're hearing this for the first time, you're thinking, what in the world are they talking about? Right? What is that supposed to even mean? How can you have an 11-dimensional world? We're still using 3D. When we see a 3D movie, we're like, wow, that's cool. It looks like real life. Well, real life is not 3D, according to theoretical physicists. It's 11D. So wait till your cinema comes out with an 11D, film or whatever it is. So this is the thing. We believe in so many things we can't perceive. When you and this is not something detailed. It's not something complex. There's a famous statement in Arabic. It says, you know what? The Bedouin, the desert dweller, they know that someone has been there by looking at the tracks in the sand. They know that something exists, right? Just by looking at the tracks in the sand. Now, how can you see a footprint, and you say, well, that footprint indicates the existence of something. You've never seen the person in your life. You don't even know what they look like. You don't know what race they are. You don't know where they came from. You don't know anything. But there's an effect that you're seeing that you're able to conclude that something made this effect, and it most likely fits this description based upon the footprint, based upon this, based upon that, and this happens all the time. You find archaeologists, they do this. They find a little tiny shard, a little tiny piece of clay, and they'll start telling you by analyzing it and saying, you know what? There was a civilization that lived in this area. It was an advanced civilization because from this little tiny piece of clay, we can tell that the way that it's shaped, this was a piece of a pot. And the pot itself was curved in such a way that indicates this civilization was familiar with the science of geometry. They were familiar with actually, pottery, and they were able to have spinning wheels. They had knowledge of baking, for example. They had knowledge of fire because they were able to bake this little piece. And they can start postulating about what type of people these were, although they've never seen them in their life, they've never seen any writings of theirs, they've never heard about them before, but they can still make conclusions based upon very solid information because that's the way our minds work, and we're able to do this. So we do this all the time. This idea that we have to see things directly in order to believe them is actually a fallacy that people argue, and if you think about the reality in which we live in, it's not the case at all. Okay? So this is fact number 1, keeping this in mind. Fact number 2 is this idea that something does not come out of nothing. The average person will believe that something does not just all of a sudden randomly pop out of nothing. So let's take an example, right? Can you imagine what life would be like if you actually believe this principle? All right? Imagine somebody comes, and this is a water balloon. This is all the clip art I could find, unfortunately. Short period of time. Imagine somebody comes from behind you and smacks you on the head. And you turn around and you see a guy right there. And you're like, man, what's up, man? Why'd you do that? He said, I didn't do that. He said, what do you mean you didn't do that? I mean, where did it come from? He said, no, you know what happened? I'll tell you what happened. All the atoms in my hand automatically transferred over towards your head, and they transferred back into my hand, and that's why you're seeing my hand like this. I didn't actually touch you. I didn't actually do anything along these lines. And the funny thing is, Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, he actually makes this argument. He says to Christians who believe, he says, if you see a statue, and this is his theoretical thing, he said, if you see a statue of the Virgin Mary, Catholics are very, showing respect to Mary, so do Muslims, of course, but without the statues. If you see a statue of Virgin Mary waving to you, right, don't believe it to be a miracle. This is what Dawkins says. Don't believe it's a miracle. It's very possible that all the atoms in the statue happen to move in the same direction in one way and then move back in the opposite direction. And he said, now, I know that's a very low probability, but scientifically, you have to believe that. Now, if you live in a world, if you really, really want to believe in a principle like that, if you live in a world where you believe that something can come out of nothing and there's no cause and just things happen randomly, you can't prove anything. So if you see a guy who just, has a gun in his hand and is still smoking, and there's a guy on the floor dead, and you match the bullet and everything, you say, you know what? No, this doesn't prove anything, right? Because hypothetically, you can't prove that I've done something wrong, because it could have just happened that the man died or the bullet just came out of the gun automatically or naturally or something like that. Can you imagine a world where people would actually not believe this reality, not believe this fact? The world would be chaos. So this is something that almost everyone believes, right? Someone throws something at somebody, something happens. You don't believe that something just pops out of nothing, like out of random, just out of nowhere, right? Not just someone just pops out of nowhere and just happens to be right here. So this is fact number 2. The fact that we have this world. We have a world that exists. We live in a world. We have mountains. We have rain. We have clouds. We have planets. We have galaxies. We have all of these things that exist around us. To believe that they just popped out of nowhere and they came out of nothing is not a very believable postulate. Right? It's not a very believable hypothesis. So what you should do is try to figure out what is an explanation in order to arrive at this type of thing. This is number 2. Number 3, examining something reveals something about the designer. These are very basic principles that all human beings understand. So when you examine something, it will tell you something about the person who's designed it. So if you examine a calculator, what would it tell you about the designer? It'll tell you that the designer had knowledge of plastics engineering. It'll tell you that the designer had knowledge of mathematics. It'll tell you that the designer was able to, make a display, for example, and had, an understanding of technology. When you look at the designer of a cell phone and what they're able to accomplish in a small cell phone, it reveals something about the thing that's actually there. The same thing applies to nature, right? If somebody knocks on your door hard, what does it tell you about the person behind the door? It tells you something, right? You can assume that at least at minimum they have the strength to be able to bang, right? If you open up the door and you find a little fish in a bowl, right? You're not going to think, well, that fish, must have been knocking at my door. So when you analyze something, wherever it is in life, it's going to reveal something about the one that actually caused this to be, or that resulted in that action. Along the same principle, we're going to come back and look at the human body. If you look at the fact that we have a digestive system, you look at the fact that we have a circulatory system, you look at the fact that we have all of these things in ourselves, how did they come about? There needs to be an explanation. And I know the explanation is going to be either one of random chance probabilities and, random Darwinism, evolution, or it's going to be some other thing that this must have been created and designed by God. So just building on all these principles, we're going to bring them all back together, talking about your immune system, talking about all these principles. And the last fact is that believing in coincidence requires a leap of faith. And this is really the key to the argument of believing in God. Is that if you believe that something is a coincidence and it's extremely, extremely unlikely, it actually requires a leap of faith to believe in that thing rather than you believing in something which actually is most probably going to take place. So let me explain what I mean by that. Okay? If you had a tornado, see this tornado in this building right here, or in this city right here? If this tornado were to sweep through the city and rip up all the materials and the pieces from these buildings, and because of that tornado ripping up everything together, it actually assembled this Lamborghini. Now, does anyone know what model this Lamborghini is, by the way? No one's into Lamborghinis. I don't even know myself. I think it's Gallardo or something like that, right? Is it? Nobody knows. Okay, that's fine. Imagine this twister comes, picks up all the metal, and forms a Lamborghini. Now, how probable do you think that is? Samir is saying 0%. Someone is going to disagree and say absolutely not. It is possible. It is possible. They would say, Samir, you're wrong. It is possible. Do you believe that it's possible? Hypothetically, is it possible? No. It's not hypothetically possible? Why not? It is. It is. It is. Logically, it's possible. This is where we have a problem. This is where people have a difficult time explaining things. And they say, no, it's absolutely impossible. No, it's not. Scientifically, statistically, it is not impossible. But it is improbable. There's a difference between the word possible and the word probable. And if you don't differentiate between the two, you're going to lose an argument every single time. Because what people are trying to prove is that if we can show that something is possible naturally, then we do not need to give a supernatural explanation for it. And this is the root, this is the core argument that atheists use today for why they don't believe in God. They say because it's technically possible that everything originated from either a small bang or a big, small bang, and then everything, just started to form by itself, or this is possible, or what is it? And you say, okay, maybe it is hypothetically possible. But if you were going to believe in something, right? If you were going to believe, for example, if somebody wins a lottery, okay, what's the probability of somebody winning the lottery? It's very rare. But can they? Yes, they can. They can win the lottery. If somebody wins a lottery today, and then they win it tomorrow, and then they win it the next day, and then they win it the next day, and then they win it the next day, how much money do you think they're going to get? Zero, because they're going to be in jail. You know why they're going to be in jail? Because no one is going to believe that that probability hit the same guy without cheating. This is what happens in Vegas. When a guy keeps on winning and winning and winning, what happens? He gets kicked out. Why? Because he's been rigging the game. Because the game is rigged against you. Right? You're not supposed to keep on winning. And if you are, that's why we don't gamble in Islam, right? So we're not allowed to gamble. If you keep on doing it, what happens? Something's wrong, because the probability has gone to an exponential level where we're not willing to believe that this is going to happen unless you have a leap of faith. So believing in something that's a coincidence, that's of such a low possibility, and rejecting the thing that has a higher probability is actually the leap of faith that people are having. And this is what happens when people actually want to disbelieve in a creator. So take a look at this example. You look at a cell. This is a human cell. Everyone who's taken high school biology knows what a cell is. You have 100 trillion of these cells in your body. 100 trillion. An average human being has 100 trillion of them, all organized in a perfect form. And every single one of them has, within the cell, there's a nucleus, and there's, all these different aspects, all little parts of the cell, and they're functioning exactly in a perfect way. They're functioning in a specific way. Now, if someone were to tell you that this little computer chip right here on the bottom left is something that, you just put a bunch of plastic together and a bunch of metal and everything, silicon, and all of a sudden you just mix it up, and it randomly formed like that, and it's doing all these processes, complex processes, the average person wouldn't believe it, because they would say that in order to produce a chip like that, a computer chip like that, is so hard to believe, it's so improbable that it's not something that we're going to naturally conclude. Likewise, if you extend the same analogy, coming back to human life, you'll find that it's so complex to believe that all of this is going to be organized randomly, and it's going to come together by itself in a perfect proportion, is something that's extremely difficult to believe. It's something that's very improbable. Even though it may be hypothetically possible to argue that, it's extremely improbable. So the thing that I'm going to argue is that believing in that type of coincidence, that yes, this could have happened, potentially, if we had infinite time and they kept on trying again and again and again and again and again, it kept on failing, and somehow it ended up happening one time and we hit the lottery, and this is exactly the way in which the world exists, this is the standard belief of all atheists today. The standard belief is that we are a product of chance, that we just happen to have the ideal circumstances in which all these chemicals, wherever they came from, somehow came together, formed together, eventually evolved, and made exactly what we are through 100% coincidence. And this is why things exist the way they exist. Now again, that becomes a very, 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 very low possibility. Whereas the opposite probability is that this something that exists, everything that exists, when we analyze the complexity, we analyze the intelligence, we analyze why things are the way they are, and we see the meaning in it, not just reading it into it, we actually realized that no, there must be something about the force that designed these things that indicates something above and beyond. So let's talk more about that. All right, so let me give you the story of Imam Abu Hanifa. To make it simpler, in case some of you are losing me, okay, I'll give you a simple story. Imam Abu Hanifa was a great scholar in the Muslim community. And one day, a group of atheists, we're talking 1200 years ago, a group of atheists, and there were atheists living in the Muslim community at the time. So they came up to him and they said, you know, Imam Abu Hanifa is so popular and people say he's such a great Muslim scholar. We challenge you to a debate on seeing whether or not God exists. We want to prove that Allah doesn't exist. So he said, okay, fine, you know, I'll have a debate with you, but right now I'm a little bit busy. We'll have a debate in the afternoon. So he said, okay, fine, we'll have a debate in the afternoon. He said, okay, meet me across the river, in that one building, and we'll meet over there and we'll have this debate. And they said, okay, fine. So they're waiting, Imam Abu Hanifa, where is he? Is he coming? He's not late. They didn't have a watch, obviously, but they're waiting. And Imam Abu Hanifa is not showing up. And Muslims at that time were known for their punctuality. Right? They were known for their punctuality. Muslim scholars were on time and everything. So they said something strange. Imam Abu Hanifa is not showing up. Maybe he chickened out. You know, a Muslim can't defend his own faith. He didn't make it. So finally he shows up late, really, really late. And he comes and they're like, what the heck? What happened? He said, you're not going to believe what happened. I'm very sorry, but you're not even going to believe what happened. He said, no, tell us what happened. Why are you late? He said, well, you know what? I had to get across that river in order to get to this building where we're going to be debating. And when I got to the river, that ferry that's supposed to take me across, it wasn't there. So I'm waiting around, thinking what to do. And all of a sudden, there was a tree there, and lightning came and struck the tree, and it fell into the river, and then the lightning came and started striking the tree even more, and it turned into a raft. And I jumped on the raft, and I came over, and I made it over here. He said, the atheists look at them and said, you really expect us to believe a stupid story like that? He said, why shouldn't you believe that when you believe that every single thing from the mountains to the skies to the earth, everything that exists in reality is the product of chance, coincidence based upon natural factors? Why should you not believe me when you're willing to believe that? And that debate was pretty much over. Right? So this is what Imam Abu Hanifa was saying long time ago. But things have not changed. Let me give you an example from a modern day textbook. This is a professor, Turkish atheist professor, not all Turks are Muslims, Turkish atheist professor, Ali Demirsoy, who is a specialist in the field of biology. This is what he says in one of his textbooks on biology. He says the probability of the formation of a cytochrome C sequence, cytochrome C is an enzyme that's essential to synthesize life, human cells. The probability of the formation of a cytochrome C sequence is as likely as 0. I want to highlight that part. So the probability of the random formation of cytochrome C as a sequence being formed randomly is as likely as 0. It's almost 0% probability. What Samir was saying, except he says almost 0 rather than 0. Right? Almost 0. And he says, but you know what? If you were to believe that opposite, otherwise, some metaphysical powers beyond our definition, meaning Allah, meaning God, should have acted in its formation. So you have two options. Either one, you believe that cytochrome C is something that formed randomly according to coincidence. Option number 1. Probability, almost 0. Option number 2, you believe that some metaphysical powers, metaphysical means something beyond this physical realm, outside of time and space. Some metaphysical powers beyond our definition should have acted in its formation, belief in God. To accept the latter, to accept the second proposition, is not appropriate to the goals of science. This is the key. This is really important. To accept the latter is not appropriate to the goals of science. Therefore, we're going to look into the first hypothesis. Now, this should raise a number of questions. What are the goals of science? And what is the purpose of science? Unfortunately, I don't have that much time to dwell on all these things, but just focus on some of these points. Think about them. So what he's saying is basically that, just look at this calculation. The probability of the random formation of a single amino acid, which is a part of a part in order for you to make up one cell, is 1 in 10 to the 950th power. So 1 in 10 to the 6th power is what number? 6 zeros. Million. 1 in 10 to the 9th power? Billion. 1 in 10 to the 12th power? A trillion. So this is 1 in 10 to the 950th power. Well, 950 zeros. That's the probability that we're talking about for just a single amino acid being formed randomly. According to mathematicians and according to scientists, this is what it would take for you to go and mix up all this material, and all of a sudden, one of these would come out in the right proportion, and it's only a part of a cell, of which you have 100 trillion inside your body. So this is what he's arguing. So Ali Demirsoy is actually saying that we need to look and we need to believe that this actually happened across the board. Why? Because according to him, this is more appropriate to the goals of science. Okay? And of course, this is like, winning the lottery, basically, right? This is something that it's not likely to, that you're going to believe. So believing in this actually requires a leap of faith, and this is where the tables turn. People need to understand that if you're not giving a good explanation to what exists around us, and you're rejecting an explanation that God is a creator and He's knowledgeable and He's the one who has knowledge and could create this, and you say, no, blind forces randomly caused all of this to take place, you're actually more likely having the leap of faith yourself than the person who's actually believing in the creator. So these are 4 points. Let's review them real quick. 4 principles. Seeing is not believing. Something does not come out of nothing. Examination reveals something about the designer. And coincidence actually requires a leap of faith. So based upon these 4 principles, you can make an argument to that why you should believe in a creator, that this world has originated through a creator who has knowledge, who has wisdom, who has power, and it's not the random work of just forces of nature or randomly popping out of nowhere or something like that. Now, there's a number of other arguments that people will make why we should not believe in God. And we're going to address as many as we can given the time. Argument number 1. There's multiple gods and there's multiple religions. And how are we supposed to know which one is correct? So if there's so many out there, everyone claims that, their religion is true. Everyone claims that their God is the right God. The Christians say that, Jesus is God, so therefore, should we believe in that? Or should we believe in the Hindu God? Or should we believe in the Greek gods? Or should we believe in some other religion's gods? So there's so many gods and there's so many religions out there. And, the religions appear to be man-made. And I'm not going to believe in a man-made system that's, to usurp people's money or their power or just give them emotional, basis or whatever it may be. This is a very, very common argument that's somehow used to prove that religion does, or that God does not exist. Because there's so many, you can't figure out which one is right. So there's just too many, I can't decide which one is correct. Now the problem with that is, right, that's this overwhelming this overwhelming information that people have thrown at them. Does it necessarily mean that because all these different religions are out there, and let's say the vast majority of them are wrong, does it mean that there cannot be a right one? If you have different conceptions of God, of who the creator actually is, does it mean that all of them must be wrong because there's so many? Logically, that's a fallacy. No one will logically believe that, because there's so many, then therefore they all must be wrong. Right? Nobody believes that. If somebody comes along and says there's 5 theories about why we really invaded Iraq. Some people will say we really invaded Iraq because we really believe they have weapons of mass destruction. Of course, that's been proven to be a lie. Came out declassified information. But all of these things, there's different theories. We went in for the oil. We went in for this other reason. We went in for that reason. Whatever it is, if you have a bunch of theories and they're conflicting, does that mean that all of them are wrong and there's no reason for it? No. That's not a logical proposition. So just because there's too many ideas and they cannot come up with one, doesn't mean that they can't figure it out. Atheism itself uses religious language. Here's a definition of atheism. The religious belief in a spontaneous, causeless, sourceless, purposeless, meaningless existence. It's taken from an atheist website. They actually pride themselves on this, right? So this is the thing. Atheism is another belief system. It's a belief of rejecting God, but if you define religion as what people actually believe, what people are actually convinced of, it's a belief system. Whether we want to class it as a rejecting something or not rejecting something, that's the way it is. So it's simply add atheism to the multiple religions that exist out there, and this should not be a cause of confusion to anyone. Skip that one. We talked about that. Argument number 2, belief doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter whether you believe or you don't believe. These are all arguments that exist on prominent atheist websites and in prominent atheist books, right? So this is why I'm bringing them up. If you've never heard them, fine. If you've heard them, you understand where they're coming from. The second argument is that belief doesn't even matter. So why should I even care? Right? Why should I even care to investigate this religion or that religion? This doesn't bother me. It doesn't fascinate me. I'm not interested in a religion. There are some people who are interested in searching for a religion. There are some people who are interested in searching for truth and all of that, but I'm not interested in that. So this is a common atheist argument. They say, you know what, it simply doesn't matter. It's not going to make any difference. Well, that is superimposing the belief that you are correct 100%, and there's nothing else that can be, that there is no God, there is no accountability, there is no paradise or hell, nothing's going to happen to you whether you believe or you don't believe. You're superimposing your own beliefs automatically on the people you're talking about. So this idea that belief doesn't matter is not a good argument against the belief in the existence of God. Argument number 3. God does so many bad things. This is a very, very common argument, especially in today's day and age. And you find it everywhere. You find it in movies. You find it on the radio, in music. You find people blaming God that he does this and he allows this, and the children are being killed here, and look at the earthquakes that killed people there, and look at the violence that's happening. Why doesn't he stop all of these things? Right? And they put themselves in the position and say, you know what? If I was in charge and I had the ability, I wouldn't allow these things to happen. Therefore, what kind of God allows these type of things to happen? And usually, this is built upon an emotional argument, especially when something has happened in your life. When you've lost a loved one, when you've lost a family member, or something really bad happened to you, you've been abused, or you've been, something happened in your life, you start thinking, well, where was God? Right? This is very, very common. Where was God? Why didn't he help me? Where was he for me? And why did he allow this to happen and all of that? And the problem with this argument, and people think that this is like an Achilles heel, this is like some kind of proof that nobody who believes in God can ever answer and give a good explanation for. The problem with this is that, number one, evil is not the norm in society. Okay? Just think about this idea of evil. Is evil the standard norm every single place we go, everything we do, everywhere we walk? Is that what you find when you go to your car right now? Is your car might be just blown up? You don't even know if you're going to make it to your car. Your car's just gone. You don't know if you're going to make it home tonight. The vast majority of you are not going to make it home tonight. No, the evil is not the norm. It's not the standard. Even in our world, even though there's a lot of bad stuff happening, it's not the standard. It's not the norm. So what we end up doing is we end up nitpicking certain things which we want to focus on and say, you know what? Look at those problems. Look at those things in the world, and we say the world is such a horrible place. Or the world is so bad, I wish it would have never been created. I wish we would have never existed. This idea about evil, having this idea, it's kind of like the pessimist-optimist argument. Is the cup half empty or is the cup half full? Depends on the way you look at it, right? If you had a bad experience in life, you may look at the world and say everyone is a molester. Everyone is a tyrant. Everyone is an oppressor. Or if you had positive experiences, or you live around and you look positive and say, you know what, there's good out there and there's some bad out there as well, and we can try to correct the bad, but there's also a lot of good out there. Depends on how you're going to look at it and how you're going to analyze it. So this argument about that God does so many bad things, first keep things in perspective. The second thing when it comes to this argument is the idea of judgment. All right? The idea of judgment, that God is testing us, right? God is testing us in this life. This is what Islam says, that God created the world in order to test people. Now, how do you test people if everything is going to be perfect and you never have any problem in your life? There's absolutely nothing has ever gone wrong in your life and you've never had an opportunity. What's going to happen? Where's the test? If you walk into a classroom, right, and all of a sudden your teacher gives you a difficult exam, are you going to start getting upset at the teacher and start yelling and say, I hate you because, you're so unfair and you're testing us and this and that? And what do? You take up the piece of paper, you crumple it up, throw it in the trash can, and say, you don't exist because you're unfair. Right? This is exactly what's amounting to people when they say, I don't believe that God exists because there's so many bad things. This idea that the world is supposed to be perfect, right? That there's not going to be any problems, arises from the belief that people don't know why we were created in the first place. So if you don't have a purpose in life, and if we're here for no reason, then yeah, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens. If we're here for a specific reason, then everything changes. All right, so keep that in mind. And source of morality, we'll skip that due to time. Skip that too. All right, again, evil is relative. Evil is a relative concept, and we need to understand that. So let me ask you, how many of you like burgers? Raise your hand if you like burgers. All right. Is it not evil to slaughter a cow so that you can eat a burger? But from your perspective, that burger is an immense source of blessing, right? So is a burger good or evil? It depends on how you look at it, right? It depends on your perspective. And only if you can put yourself in an objective perspective of what is really true can you define what is good and what is evil. And if you don't understand why you exist, if there is a purpose in life and you don't understand the purpose in life, you will never be able to figure out what is good and what is evil because you don't even know why you exist. You don't even know why you're here. And if you're here due to coincidence and just randomly you happen to be here, then of course there is no good and there is no evil. Everything could be evil because you're always going to feel some problems. The best course, maybe, for people would simply be suicide and they kill themselves because they have no purpose. They don't want to suffer any type of pain, and the pleasure that they get is not worth it for them. But the vast majority of people will not even take that option because why do the vast majority of atheists not shoot themselves in the head? Because they enjoy the good things and the pleasures of life. Therefore, it's not always that this life is evil, even though we tend to exaggerate it, even though we tend to look at it from this perspective. So evil is relative and it needs to be seen in that context. All right? The teacher and student argument I gave you, right? It's a logical fallacy. Here's the problem. It's simple logic, actually. And philosophers have actually discussed this. Even atheist philosophers said, you need to stop making this argument because it's not an argument against the existence of God. So here's the argument. If God is good, defining good, if God is good, then there should be no problems in the world, right? But there are problems in the world. Therefore, either God is bad or God does not exist. That's the way the argument goes. It's logical, right? And you say, well, it's logical. And you know, when Muslims use the word logical, they think logical actually means something that's like a good argument or a good proof. That's not what logical means. Logical just means simply the way that you set up your propositions in order to arrive at a conclusion. It doesn't necessarily mean because something is logical that is true or that is correct, right? So keep that in mind. So here's the problem. There's a false assumption. What's the false assumption in this statement? If God is good, there would be no problems in the world. The first assumption is if God is good? No. The false assumption here is that there would be no problems in the world. Right? The fact that if God is good, there is not allowed to be any problems in the world. And there's problems, obviously. Islam solves this issue very simply by saying life is a test. So now if life is a test, there needs to be problems in the world. There needs to be challenges and difficulties in the world. Otherwise, you wouldn't have a test. So that solves that issue. That resolves that issue, and that argument pretty much sets the rest. It's like saying, if my teacher was nice, they'd give me the answers to the test. Logical, but it's not reality, right? And my students always, always complain about this. Right? But you cannot make this argument. So you say, if you don't give me the answers to the test, you're not a nice teacher. You can't make that argument, right? Even though on the face of it, it looks like it would add up, it doesn't really add up when you reflect further upon it. So this is not a good argument for believing in, removing disbelieving in the existence of God. We're going to skip all of this due to time. This is my primary argument, okay? I know there's a lot of questions. I'm going to take questions from the audience one at a time. Please keep it to questions and not comments, okay? So questions. I assume that there would be a lot of questions. False assumption, absolutely. Yes, Brother Bakr.
I love the lecture.
That's a comment. No, I'm just kidding. Alhamdulillah.
Have you implemented this argument with agnostic people and atheists and actually changed their view?
Okay, good question. Have I actually implemented this argument with agnostic people and atheist people and changed their view? Well, let me tell you that I lost belief myself. And these are some of the arguments that brought me back. So one, it worked for me. And two, yes, I have applied it with several of my friends. And it worked with some, and it didn't work with others. So it works with some people, it doesn't work with some people. And I want to bring my point back to the beginning. And I said that belief and disbelief this is my argument after thinking about this for a long time. It is not purely intellectual. It's not purely intellectual. A lot of it is emotional, both belief and disbelief, and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, depending on what kind of emotion we're talking about, right? So what happens is, if you've had a bad experience in your life, and let me just give you a simple example. I give you an example at the beginning, right? Let me restate that example. If your parents or your Sunday school teacher was teaching you how to pray, and they yelled at you one day for not placing your hands in the right position. And then later on, you go and you meet some Muslim friends, and they're memorizing the Quran in school, and after school they're going out and they're smoking weed and they got girlfriends and they're drinking. So in your mind, number one, you hate your Islamic school teacher because they treated you badly. Number two, you see that these kids who are supposed to be the top and they're being honored in the Muslim community for memorizing the Quran, you found that they had hypocritical behavior, the few of them that you had observed. Now in your mind, what ends up settling in your mind is that, especially when you're younger, Islam as a religion, there's hypocrisy built in, there's people with bad manners. This is what Islam, for me, in your mind, starts to represent. And what ends up happening is, someone will come to you, and one day you'll come along, and if you've been affected by this, and you go further and further away from Islam or from Allah, you start saying, I don't even know if I believe in Allah anymore. And you're trying to get to, and so what's going to happen is those parents are going to bring that child to me, that kid, whatever, teenager or something, to me and say, Sheikh, talk to the kid. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to tell him, you know what? So what I've had this dozens of times. Sit there and I'm talking to the person, I'm saying, so why don't you believe in God? Well, religion is all a sham and this is all hypocrisy and this is this and that. I said, we're talking about God. Let's just focus on God. Do you believe this world was created or you don't believe it was created? You say, I don't really know about that and this and that. So you start going through the proofs, just like I talked to you about. You start talking about this, you start talking about that. And at the end, they're like, look, man, my issue is not all of this. My issue is the hypocrisy that I witnessed from this community member or that person or that one person who hit me or that one person who did something to me. That is the emotional baggage that ends up defining who people are and how they determine what they're interested in pursuing and what they're not interested in pursuing. So that's why I want to reiterate that, you know what? I have used this a lot, but you have to realize that it's not always an intellectual issue. It's not, you can sit there, and I've had people come to me and say, at the end of the conversation, you know what, I believe in all of that. In fact, I believe the Quran is the best book and everything makes sense, everything else makes sense, but I hate the things that I've seen in the community. And that's the thing. So now again, it's intellectual versus an emotional, spiritual type of crisis that people are undergoing, right? And we have to realize that this is the thing. It's not pure intelligence that, according to Islam, it's not pure intelligence that leads people to belief. There's more than intelligence to getting success in life. I just gave a lecture today actually about this. Scientists have concluded that children, in order to determine whether they're going to be successful in life, the most important factor is not intelligence. What's 200% more important than intelligence? Self-control. Self-control. So self-control and internal morality plays a role. That's why you can have the most intelligent astrophysicist, NASA scientist, whatever it may be. He can calculate equations that no one else in the world can ever equate, right? Compute. At the same time, you may find the simplest Bedouin desert dweller walking around, doesn't know anything about anything. According to Islam, in the sight of God, this person made a decision that was better than this person's decision. And how did that happen? We value the intellect only in many people in today's society. And we think that the intellect is automatically going to make you arrive at the truth. Whereas the reality is, other factors play a role. How do you know the person who has a large intellect, huge intellect, very intelligent, doesn't have pride and arrogance blocking them from doing other things? How do you know they don't have a level of self-control over themselves? So there are more factors than arriving at belief in God or belief in Islam than simply the intelligence. And we need to keep that in mind. Yes?
What you're referring to, is that talked about in what is called emotional intelligence these days?
No, emotional intelligence is different. Emotional intelligence is a little bit different. So this is more about, what's the right term for it? It's more about self-discipline and self-control. It's a little bit different than emotional intelligence. Nino? 5 minutes. Okay. Yes. But any sisters? Questions? Yes? Question? No? Okay. Go ahead.
Brother, I asked you this previous question. I'm going to say two statements. ولا تخوضوا مع الخائضين وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون. The two verses, if you implement them to the argument, because sometimes I get engaged in discussions, and I want to be afraid that I don't want to go into an argument and follow the verse ولا تخوضوا مع الخائضين. What is the deadline? Where is the red fine line where I need to end that conversation so that I don't go into the verse ولا تخوضوا مع الخائضين?
Okay. So the question is about argumentation. All right. So if you're, yeah. So if you're going to be arguing with people, okay, understand one thing is give people the benefit of the doubt when you're discussing with them, when you're arguing with them, initially. Always give them the benefit of the doubt, right? Because it's an educational opportunity. Think of it as education. Our responsibility as Muslims is to educate other people, right? About what Islam says, about what belief actually means. When you find it getting to the level of a debate, in the sense that the person is not listening to what you're saying, right? That's when you should stop the discussion, right? When you feel the person is not, you've already delivered the message to them, you've explained to them what your position is, and they're not interested, they're not listening to you anymore, and they're just simply responding back and it's not going anywhere, that's when you stop the discussion, and you can try again later on. But you always be respectful. Always be respectful whenever you're talking with someone. These are all human beings and they all have goodness in them. Remember the Prophet, peace be upon him, he said that people are like mines of gold and silver. Right? People are like mines of gold and silver, and what the best of them before Islam end up becoming the best of them in Islam. Which means what? If you're a mine of gold and silver, it means you have the potential to unlock all this goodness that's built into you. If you can get past certain hurdles, right, and see the reality of the truth of what it really is. When you actually get there, all the goodness in that person starts manifesting itself in a way that may actually be better than yourself. So we should always remain humble, and we should always be careful in the way we discuss with other people. Right? Yes.
You said about the inheritance of the religion.
Yes.
And it's actually something that I always think about and we talk about also with friends. For example, like we raise up as Muslims, we consider that Islam is the best religion and the correct religion. Pretty much everybody else, whoever their religion is, they will raise up the same way. So Christian, they just raise up as Christian.
Right.
Go to the church.
Right.
Jesus, Son of God.
Right.
So and so. Now, when they get to the point where do they need really to think about are we right or wrong? So Muslims, we don't think about this. So
This is where I disagree. Right? So what the brother is saying is that, everyone's raised upon the religion, that they grew up in, and he's saying Muslims don't think about whether they're right or wrong or this and that, and I disagree completely. Whether you're consciously thinking or you're not consciously thinking, everyone actually is making a conscious decision whether they're going to go ahead and follow what they were raised upon or they're not going to follow it. And you see so many examples to the contrary. So just because you find a lot of people, it just so happens that people tend to be very dogmatic. Just because people are dogmatic and they tend to say, well, I'm going to do exactly what my parents said, I'm going to follow exactly the same thing, doesn't necessarily mean that this is something built in internally, no one is making any decision. You make a choice in life everywhere you go. When you're gonna choose what kind of food you eat, you make a conscious decision. When you're gonna choose how you're gonna study, or you're not gonna study and you're gonna play around instead, you make a conscious decision, right? So even in religion, whether or not you're thinking about it deeply or you're not thinking about it deeply, you've made a decision. Am I gonna stay or am I not gonna stay? Every single Muslim child, for example, when you're 19 years old, and let's say you say, well, I've never thought about really religion. I just do what my parents told me to do and I keep on following it. You make a decision when nobody's watching you. Either you're going to go and perform wudu and you're going to pray with like some kind of, consciousness in your mind, or you're going to say, I'm going to skip wudu. No one's even going to see whether I make wudu or not. And I'm going to be sitting there reciting the lyrics to my favorite song while I'm pretending to pray with everybody else. You could do that. And nobody else would know, except God, of course. Nobody else would know. But the vast majority of people choose not to do that, right? And we automatically assume, they say, no, they're doing that due to social conformity. Social conformity is outward, right? It's outside of what you can see. In your mind, when you're praying, you choose to recite the Fatiha, you recite Quran, or you choose to just simply play around and think about things and just sing a song or whatever it is. And I think the vast majority of people don't do that. They don't do that. That's my assumption. I mean, I don't know for sure. I don't know what's in their mind. I would assume that they don't do that. And if they don't do it, the question is, why didn't they do it? Because they made a conscious decision that we're going to go ahead and we're actually going to make the prayer internally, that no one else is listening to me, but I'm going to make it the right way. There's a reason why they did it, and they made a choice. So everyone does make a choice. Everyone who has some level of sanity makes a choice. They may outwardly conform in many things, but inwardly they have a choice and they've made a choice. Yes. Yes. What was that? What can you do to your son? You will not know. That's the whole point. Oh, okay. I mean, if right. So, let's skip the wudu part. So that's another issue. You talk to me privately. But let's assume that your son is not saying the words he's supposed to say during his prayer. How would you ever know about it? You'll never know. You will never know. It's between him and Allah. So your responsibility is to teach him and train him what is right, give him a good Islamic education, explain to him why you believe in what you believe. And then your burden is lifted from you. That's your responsibility. Last question. No question? Okay. So we're done. It looks like 9:26, 27. Okay. We're done, inshallah. Any other questions, you can email me, mustafa@iioc.com, or I'll stick around a few minutes. You can talk to me, inshallah. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum.